believe. But I'm also a Unitarian Universalist because I don't have all the answers. And I choose to associate with people who are also searching for answers, maybe even in other traditions. My path has been a long one. I left the Presbyterian Church because I could no longer believe or understand what it was trying to teach me. I wanted to find a spiritual home, a place where being a religious liberal would give me the freedom to search for answers unbound by any set of beliefs. And I found to my amazement that the answer for me was Christianity. But it was a new kind of Christianity. My Christianity doesn't dwell so much on the divinity of Jesus as it does who he was as a man and the message that he preached. Jesus offered a radical challenge that's challenging but nearly impossible to ignore. Most UUs have different spiritual paths, but we've all found a spiritual home in this journey toward ultimate meaning. What bonds us is the reality of beloved community. As Jesus put it, "In my Father's house there are many rooms." Well, you may have noticed in these last couple of months that we've continued to take baby steps to finish our sanctuary decor since the big renovation last year where we did the carpeting and the painting and tech stuff. And we're close to being done, as evidenced by the fact that many of you know we've gone outside to do external landscaping now. There's just one element left that remains unfinished, and that is obtaining sacred symbols that celebrate and identify who we are. We have a plan. There's going to be 3 pieces. One is an artistic creation of a non-traditional cross denoting our Christian heritage. The other 2 symbolize each of our affiliated denominations, unless I disappoint you by not having a trivia question this morning. Which of our 2 denominations, we have Disciples of Christ, we have Christian Unitarian Universalism, which has a chalice as its symbol? Disciples, you are correct. It's disciples. However, it was a trick question. You would also be correct if you said Christian Unitarian Universalism. Some of you may not know that the symbol for the UU faith is a flaming chalice. It was created by the Unitarian Service Committee, which was a group back in the day, they still exist, but back in the day of World War II, this group helped Jewish refugees escape Nazi persecution. Because there were language barriers, they needed some kind of a symbol that they could wear that would show the Jewish people that they were the good guys there to help. So every element on this symbol means something. The chalice, as usually is the case, represents communion, community. The flame represents the light of reason and truth. And then, after the merger of Unitarianism and Universalism in 1961, they added 2 interlocking rings around the flaming chalice, which represents the coming together of the 2 religions into one. UUs often refer to a quote by Edwin Markham regarding the intertwined rings. He said, "He drew a circle that shut me out. Heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle and took him in." So that's our UU lesson for the day. History-wise, you might remember that last Sunday we did a lot of UU history. Last week and today we are exploring this new faith that we've chosen, especially because we acknowledge that often this is a misunderstood faith. It reminds me of something Mark Wyman shared with me soon after. That's right, Mark, I'm talking about you. Shared with me soon after I arrived here 3 years ago. He told me the story of a man who insisted that Mark couldn't be a Christian because of his progressive views, which did not reflect real Christianity. How many of you have heard that story from Mark before? A couple of us. Well, it's a good story, and Mark reported that his definitive response was, "I am a Christian. I can identify with the Christians if I choose to, and I choose to." Right on, brother. And then last week, when I spoke of a former neighbor of mine saying that UUs were grass worshipers, Kathy shared that she was in a setting once when Unitarians were being mocked as loony unis. And because we know that these perceptions exist, there are some concerns that we have about what others might think of us having a UU association. So it's important for us to appreciate and understand what is it and who is it that we say we are. I'm remembering one of you telling me, again, early on, how for years you would sit during a Sunday service and metaphorically cross your fingers with much that was said and sung because you didn't mean most of it, you didn't believe most of it. And I find it fascinating, and that's not the only story that I've heard like that from our gathering here. It's fascinating that while we have remained anchored in our non-denominational disciples of Christ, we've also migrated from someplace else to this UU faith, and that someplace else is usually another Christian setting. We heard about this in the reading, and yet the idea of us becoming UU only works if we retain our Christian identity. It might be confusing to someone who's looking on to hear that we've migrated from Christian traditions where we have to cross our fingers to get through it, but still it's imperative that we keep the Christian identity. It's not perplexing to us, though, is it? The piece that makes all of this fit is Jesus. And based on that, we have to answer a central question. How does Jesus fit into Unitarian Universalism? It is a head scratcher for some. So we've got a pretty good working understanding of who Jesus is, but maybe we're not quite as familiar yet with what the UU piece is. Well, to answer that, one has to consider the core of it, which is found in 7 values. You might have heard of Buddhist Eightfold Path, Christianity's 10 Commandments, of course, the 5 pillars of Islam. Well, the UUs have 7 values. Let us not be confused with values being the same thing as beliefs. Have you ever considered the difference between the two? It can get foggy in religious circles. What may seem like minutia actually starts to get underneath why people migrate from there to here. Beliefs are assumptions about truth that shape your perceptions of reality. Perceptions, assumptions. Values speak to what matters to a person and serve as a guidepost for your behavior. One is more passive, typically more aligned with what we inherit, while the other is more active and addresses what we do and how we live. On the screen now, In a moment, you'll see a graphic of these 7 UU values. And let's just see, we'll pop through them, and let's see how Jesus fits into each one of them. And I will give you a teaser. All but one are pretty expected, but there's always that one. So the first one, interdependence, the interconnection of all creation. This is aimed at all of creation, sometimes, especially the planet. And Jesus frequently speaks in these terms. I'm thinking of the metaphor he gives where branches wither when they're not connected to the vine. Another value, transformation, continually spiritually growing. Jesus, in and of himself, was a transformative dude, and his teachings transformed the entire human race to a degree. Generosity, where does he fit in there? Gratitude, giving. This reminds me of how much he extolled the poor woman who had 2 little coins, and it's all she had. And that's what she offered. Giving, being there, even when it hurts. The next 2 kind of go together. Equity speaks to every single person's inherent worth and dignity, and that's first cousin to justice, which addresses actively working on behalf of that dignity, especially for people who are marginalized. And my friends, I think that Jesus spoke mostly about this one, compassion for the poor and the marginalized. And then there's pluralism, the celebration of drawing from diverse cultures and other theologies, and this one's the sticky wicket. More than one author has said that this value is the one that Jesus totally would have rejected because he clearly said, I am the way and the truth and the life, and nobody gets to God except through me. What's overlooked here is that Jesus never said he was starting a religion and that that particular religion was the portal. What he was trying to say is this way of being that I am modeling for you, this way of love is the way to fulfillment. There's no back door. There's no plan B on this one. And this way of being, found in all genuine spiritual paths, is there. They just have different names. We'll hear more on that in a moment. But speaking of the way of love, as you will see, love is in the center of the UU values. It's the core to the rest of them, bringing them together. And when asked, what's the most important thing, Jesus? One thing. Give it to us in a breath. Love God, love each other. It was about love. So that's the conclusion of our brief, but I think ample overview. And taking that quick look, I hope that it's apparent that Jesus is mirrored throughout the UU guideposts. Another interesting but often overlooked reflection between Jesus and UUism, both challenged the religious establishment of the day, this establishment that prioritized laws over love and believing over being and living. Story after story, we all know Jesus would tell, this master storyteller. He told these parables so people would get it. These stories had to do with how to follow his example of living. Reverend Brandon Robertson spoke to this when he said, there's a long institutionalized story in Christianity of taking the radical renegade rabbi from Nazareth and turning him into a religious figure to be worshiped instead of to be followed. And this led me to wonder if immersion in the glorification of Jesus contributes to people overlooking the whole point of his message. And the first thing that comes to my mind when I think that is January 6th in the nation's capital. Let us see some slides of the use of Jesus in that setting. I can just flip through them there. Yeah, we've all seen them. This is an example of using Jesus when the actions couldn't be further away from being like him. And it calls to mind when Gandhi said, "I like your Christ, but I don't like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." That's an example of how not to live our tradition. The next story is on the other end of the spectrum. It plays out in a true story that the teller, Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, called The Stranger on the Bus. What would you do if you met the stranger on the bus? It happened in Munich, in Nazi Germany. A woman had been riding the city bus home from work when SS troopers suddenly stopped the coach and began examining the identification papers of the passengers. Most were annoyed, but a few were terrified. Jews were being told to leave the bus and get into a truck around the corner. The woman watched from her seat in the rear as the soldiers systematically worked their way down the aisle. She began to tremble, tears streaming down her face. When the man next to her noticed she was crying, he politely asked her why. "I don't have papers that you have. I'm a Jew. They're going to take me." Suddenly, the man exploded in disgust. He began to curse and scream at her. He said, "You stupid cow, I can't believe I'm standing next to you." This brought the SS men over and asked the men and women who were seated, "What's this all about? Why are you yelling?" "Damn her!" the man shouted angrily. "My wife has forgotten her papers again. I'm fed up. She always does this." The soldiers laughed and passed them by. Being immersed in a living faith means having the courage to speak up for a fellow traveler. Obviously, this wasn't represented in the images that we saw a moment ago on the tack that was carried out in the name of Jesus by some. And it reminds us that names and labels are worldly constructs which can be misleading, but at the same time can be useful identifiers. We all use them. Just this morning, it reminded me a little story of my buds, Mike and Wendy. Back in the day, about 25 years ago, the kids' other mom and I asked them, our dearest friends, to be the godparents of our children. And Wendy looked directly at me and said, "You know, if your kids end up with us, they will be raised as Jews." And I looked right back at her, not missing a beat, and said, "Fabulous, but you make sure they're the best Jews they can possibly be." The living is more important than the labeling. And that brings us back to our denominational labeling. If we're going to truly live into an identity as Christian Unitarian Universalists, we're called to unequivocally do two things: embrace and embody the values that Jesus modeled, and do unapologetically the exact same thing with our UU values. And Mark, The next time some guy tells you that you can't be a Christian because you don't fit the mold, you can throw him for a real loop and tell him you're a Christian Unitarian. And then set him straight on why it's a perfect fit. This fit the mold thing reminds me of the moment in the film Gandhi when a fellow Hindu was upset with Gandhi, asking him, "Are you still a Hindu?" Because Gandhi had been so generous with other faith tradition people. And Gandhi's response was one of the moments in my movie-going history that had the deepest impact on me. All these years later, it has crossed my mind dozens of times. He looks back at his counterpart and he says, "Yes, I am a Hindu, and I'm also a Christian, and a Buddhist, and a Muslim, and a Jew." And then he elaborates that true religion transcends these specific groupings and labels. And he summed it up with one simple 4-letter sentence: God has no religion. For him, being a true Hindu included all that I know to be the best in Islam and Christianity and Buddhism and Judaism. And my friends, no bigger or better or more accurate you statement has ever been uttered. That's the spirit of pluralism. And I can hear Jesus saying the same thing. And on the other side of that same coin is that the best of him is in every single one of these true traditions. And isn't that beautiful? And so, if we're doing the math, this answers our question of the day: was Jesus a Jewish UU? He not only fits our mold, he epitomized what it is to be a UU, Jewish style. And so how fortunate we are to call him our own, even if pretty much everybody else does too, given that his universal message resides wherever love is. So that's the message of the day. And I can't wait to hear what some of your thoughts are about this as we continue to be exposed to this new faith tradition we've taken on, and you continue to learn a little bit more about what it means to be a UU, a Christian UU.